Good morning, 8th grade. Hopefully you guys had a good Monday. It was really nice to see you guys yesterday in the Zoom session. I know there wasn't that many of us there, but at least we were there. Hopefully you guys can all show up tomorrow for our Zoom session because it's always nice. And as we're coming down to the end of the school year, it's just nice for us to keep that connection. So yesterday we did talk about the slave codes and how they were treated and how badly they were treated. How they had strict rules on them. They put laws to keep them in order. They were punishing them to put fear into their eyes. We talked about the slave auctions, how it kind of like broke up families and how family was something that was really important to them. So this was just the horrible life of the slaves, and we talked about how not only it was men and women. So just imagine, like, the worse it gets worse. It always does. But today we are going to move into something different. We're going to talk about the slave culture, because the slaves were able to create their own culture, which kind of like helped them get through. And the culture and everything that they had was really what made them get through these times, even through these difficult times. And it wasn't just culture, it was family, community, and religion. So we're going to go ahead and get into that today. So let's go ahead and review the questions from yesterday first. So number one, how did slaveholders control slaves? So what they did was they passed these slave codes, and these slave codes controlled them. One thing that they did to control them was they would punish them, and they would put fear in their eyes and use them as publicly humiliate them. This helped them control the slaves because many slaves were scared to do anything wrong because of these harsh punishments. Remember, we talked about them throwing them into holes, and they had to stand for a week or two until they died, or just had to be out there for a few weeks just so they know their punishment. They would be stripped naked and whipped and be used as examples. So these are how slaves controlled their slaves, or slaveholders controlled the slaves. Number two, what effects do you think the strict slave codes had on enslaved Africans? Some of the effects that you can think about was it kept them in line, it put fear into their eyes, and it also made them start to really hate the slave owners, which is going to start to give them and start to maybe want them to rebel and start to have this this punishment or this urge in their chest to rebel against them, which we'll talk about later on. Number three, do you think the skilled slaves had advantages over other slaves? Why or why not? So there's two answers that I saw from you guys. Some of you guys said they had advantages, yes, because they were able to get money and try to pay for their freedom. And then that's a good advantage because you were getting treated a little bit better because you had these special talents. Another part that you guys said they didn't have special privileges because now these slaves were more valuable to the slaveholders, and they were more likely to pretty much get more money for these slaves, so they would want to sell them. So there's two different perspectives, and I'm glad that you guys were able to see both of them. Okay. So like I said, today we are going to talk about the slave culture. So let's go ahead and get into the cultures of the slaves. So many slaves, they found comfort in their community and in culture. Okay, so they made time for social activities even after exhausting work days in order to relieve the hardships of their lives. So after the day was over, they would normally come together and just enjoy each other's company and try to forget about what was going on during the day by singing songs, telling stories, and everything like that. Okay, so one thing that was really important to them was family. Family was probably the most important aspect of slave communities. And this is why slaves feared and hated the auctions, because they hated the possibility of them getting separated from their families. And sometimes they were actually more scared of separating from their families than getting punishment. So if their families were getting separated, they would rebel and try to go do anything they possibly could to go and hang out with their family a little bit more. Okay, so family was really important for them. There's a story about this guy. His name is Josiah Henson, and he never forgot the day that his family was auctioned. So his mother begged the slaveholder who brought her to buy Josiah, but when the slaveholder pretty much separated everybody in her family, he was about 6 years old, and it was something that just stuck in his head. Just remember seeing his mom and his dad taken away from him, and him just being stuck with nobody, not knowing anybody. Imagine being 5 and 6 and getting your family taken away from you. So family was something that was really important to them. So enslaved parents, what they did was they wanted to keep their heritage or their family history alive. And the way they did this was they did this by passing on stories of the family history, of African customs and traditions. Since there wasn't really any writing or reading, everything was passed down verbally. If you remember when we learned about West Africa history back last year, everything was verbal history or oral history. And this is what happened, and it kept from the slaves, and they kept passing them down orally. These stories that they told were called folk tales, and pretty much what these stories were was they were telling stories about how to survive in these religions. Sorry about that. I totally forgot that I had a slide, so I'll go ahead and start over. So these slaves, what they did was they wanted to pass down their heritage from their families, and they did it with folk tales. And these folk tales had stories with morals, okay? And pretty much these stories were told to teach lessons about how to survive under slavery. So the African slaves, what they did, one good thing that they did was they always tried to look at things as with a positive outlook. They knew they were slaves, they knew life was hard, but they didn't really complain. They kind of fought through it, and the reason why is because they had their family. This was something that their time with their family was something that's very valuable. Okay, so these folk tales, they often included a clever animal, which was called like a trickster, and the tricksters would often represent the slaves. And the stories would always have the trickster defeating stronger animals by outwitting them or outsmarting them. And these other animals were kind of being like the slaveholders. So the folktales, they told the slaves that they can survive by outsmarting their slaveholders. And to always think positive. And we can outsmart them and we can still overcome slavery. So this was something that they found comfort in because these motivational stories, these encouraging stories and family time was very valuable for them. Sometimes like us, when we see difficult times, we can tell ourselves, like motivate ourselves, like we can do it. And that's kind of like what the slaves did. And they always had this drive mentality that they can get through this and everything will be fine. Another important aspect that went along with their family and community was religion. This was another area where they were able to come together and have ceremonies. So religion played an important part in the slave culture. By the 1800s, most of these slaves were Christians, okay? And they came to see themselves as like the slaves that were in the Old Testament, like the Hebrews. If you remember, the Hebrews were like God's chosen people, and they were slaves to the people in Egypt. And then we had Abraham that came and freed them. So these slaves, they saw themselves as God's chosen people because they saw that the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt and they were freed. And the slaves thought, well, maybe our time is coming. We're just waiting for the right person to come and free us. So they thought they were the chosen people. And they had faith that someday someone would come and give them freedom. Okay? Another thing that these slaves did was they sang these things called spirituals. And they were like emotional Christian songs that blended African and European music. And this is kind of like the basis of like gospel music, of blues music. A lot of this stuff came, and this is how they were able to worship God. One thing though, that these ceremonies, they had to be held in secret from their slave owners, because if the slave owners saw that the slaves had something in common, or they had this community, they would pretty much punish them and split them up, and so they could never do this ever again. So all these things had to be held in secret and out of sight of the religions. So some things that they were doing, they did this and it provided them with community, but if they ever were to get caught, they would all get punished. So this is something that they did not want to risk being put in front of the slave owners, because this is the only thing they had to bring them comfort, was their family and religion. So they wanted to keep all this stuff a secret. So eventually, with these family traditions and culture and religion, they all started to, and the way they were getting treated, they all started to get these ideas of rebellion, okay? So, because not everyone can be handled like this. Some people are going to need to rebel, and this is what the slaves wanted to do. So maintaining their own religious beliefs and practices were only which way they resisted the slaveholders' attempt to completely control them. But slaves, they rebelled against the system every single day, okay? And it was kind of like a hidden way of doing it. So sometimes they would work slower to protest long hours, so they would just work slow and say, well, you do the work then. But they wouldn't say anything. They would just work slow. That's how one way they would protest. Another way what they would do is they would run away sometimes. And they would run away from their angry slaveholders because they were scared of getting punished. So they would just run away and hopefully never get caught and try to escape. Another thing that they would do was they would try to escape and go see their relatives. Remember, during the auctions, they would get they can hear where they were getting sold to, and they would go and try to find these plantations and escape and go and try to reunite with their families. When they would do this though, a lot of these slaves, they would escape, but they would get caught. And pretty much what was happening, like I said though before, seeing their family was way more important to them than getting punished. So they didn't care. So they would allow to escape. So a lot of these slaves, they would try to rebel. And eventually all these slaves, they started to get together and started to realize like we should all just rebel and start to go and try to gain our freedom. One thing about this though, when you rebelled and escaped, gaining freedom by escaping to the north was extremely hard. This was something that was very difficult. And if you were ever captured, you were pretty much sent back. Definitely you were going to get punished or you would get killed. Okay? Thousands and thousands of slaves were punished and killed because of them trying to escape. And remember, when the slave trade was coming, they brought over millions and millions of slaves. And this is something that they weren't really caring, but they put really harsh punishments. And because of these slaves trying to do this, more strict codes were coming. But we'll leave that till tomorrow's lesson. We'll talk about that tomorrow. So as a quick review, we started to talk about how family and community was something that was really important, and also religion. So this was the only thing that the slaves had during these times to bring them comfort. Being with the family, being with their community, and talking about religion. This was the only thing that gave them comfort. Remember, a lot of these things were getting passed down orally and verbally because they had no writing system. They would tell folk tales, which would teach morals of the story. But family was, at the key, the most important thing. They were more likely to risk their lives to see a family member than to get punished. They didn't care about punishment. They just wanted to be with their family. Religion came into play, but they also had to be very cautious when they did their religion. They had to practice in secret because they didn't want to get caught, and they didn't want to get this taken away by their slave owners. Eventually, some of these slaves are going to want to start to rebel and start to escape, and they started to do this a little bit by little. Tomorrow we are going to talk about the rebellions. But yeah, that was just a quick review of what we learned today. For homework, I want you guys to answer these questions. Number 1, how did slaves' religious beliefs alter their attitudes towards slavery? Sorry, it's supposed to be alter, not after. So how did these slave beliefs alter their attitudes towards slavery? Number 2, how did enslaved parents work to ensure that their children never forgot their heritage? What did they do to make sure that the kids never forgot where they came from or their history? And number 3, how did slaves try to maintain a sense of community? What did they do to keep the community alive? What did they do to keep peace? What did they do to keep the family together? So that concludes our lesson for today. It was nice and short. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm here to help you, to give you some guidance on the questions if you need help. If not, hopefully I can see you guys all tomorrow in our Zoom session. Wednesday, it'll be at 11 o'clock again. So please try to join that Zoom so we can all hang out together again. If not, I hope you guys have a great Tuesday, and I'll see you guys all tomorrow.